Yes, dear friends. Today we want to talk about the human breeders, known in specialist circles as the governments, politicians, or simply dystopian, end-time cults, who operate in the background and who now rule the whole world. Many will be interested to know what strategies these psychopaths have developed in the evolution of slavery in order to control and manage their property better. What have they written on their to-do list to control and change people so that they do not longer question their captivity and their loss of freedom and almost see their captivity as God-given, where it is as natural to them, like the air that they breathe? They are treated like cows or sheep surrounded by borders and not fences, where they do not want to go beyond their fences under any circumstances if a shepherd and his dogs forbid it. What strategies had to be used to influence the slaves so much that they were prepared to sacrifice most of their freedom for a few colorful scraps of paper, of which they themselves had to give up a large part in order to continue financing the prison they had built for themselves, without ever having the opportunity to leave it or take control of their own lives? Of course, these are questions that hardly anyone in the world who is born into slavery asks themselves, because they interpret the captivity in which they live as freedom. They only know their captivity, which is a kind of normality for them. They do not miss their freedom because they were never allowed to experience it. They were born directly into slavery by the human breeders and integrated into their systems from birth. Their function and area of use were determined by their owners so that they could be utilized and exploited as profitably as possible. Their dreams, desires, and goals, nothing was left to chance. In the course of evolution, they were constantly optimized and adapted. Breeders made their human farms more and more efficient, and if the goals were not achieved, the game was restarted until the result was right. Entire colonies were wiped out by invented wars or poison attacks, and the game restarted if breeding was not successful, where the warmongers on both sides knew each other very well. Wars and genocides have proved very useful in wiping out the herd with weapons and more recently chemicals. The herd slaughtered each other on both sides as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and even awarded each other medals for their own stupidity. In this way, the victims themselves have always helped to get themselves executed or poisoned for the interests of their owners, so that the game could start all over again. In the course of the development of human breeding, organizations emerged that carried out massacres around the world under the guise of religion, environmental protection, peace, health, or human rights, and allowed themselves to be celebrated and paid for by the slaves. It was and is a perfidious game where death and destruction is the order of the day, played not only by the human breeders, but also, perfidiously, by the slaves themselves, because some of them profit from the suffering. But what is the background to these power-obsessed psychopaths who want to rule and dominate the whole world and change and shape it according to their own ideas? Is it the religious motives of some end-time sect? Or rather the fantasies of a mentally disturbed person who is passing on his legacy to the next generation of tyrants, so that suffering and slavery never end? Or is it just a modern strategy that has evolved over the last 100 years, during which time several rulers have cut their teeth on successfully running a slave colony, and whose successes have led to the world they have trapped us in today, in which we have only two choices: to submit or to die? However, we should realize that our submission and acceptance of an inhumane system akin to a slave colony will plunge us into much greater suffering, and that the suffering that the generations to come will experience is beyond our imagination. I also cannot, with the best will in the world, imagine that there are people who are prepared to be given a digital identification number, like a cow, to be managed as recognized system slaves in a human breeding system, and then to wear this number either as an ID card, as a microchip under the skin, or fused with the identification features of the face, so that the slave owners can locate and abuse their resources at any time. Do people no longer have any dignity? Do they like to be treated like the staff of a company, where they have no rights, but are only allowed to act according to the employer's instructions? And the freedoms they are granted are not real freedoms, but only temporary releases from captivity. Like a prisoner in open prison who is allowed out for a certain period of time. Like the disenfranchised, who are only as free as their rulers and oppressors allow them to be. As already mentioned, it is very difficult to explain what freedom means to slaves who were born into slavery. Those who have spent their entire lives in slavery, indoctrinated and dominated, have internalized this condition to such an extent that arguments evaporate like drops of water on a hot hob. The programming is so deeply anchored in the brain's neuronal system that certain information can neither be interpreted nor felt because the foundations for processing information are missing and would have to be learnt anew. It's like a bird having wings, but not knowing what to do with them because it doesn't know how to use them. The hardware is there, but what good is the best hardware if it is not connected, and the right program is missing? Really nothing, like a bicycle without a bicycle chain. When confronted with their imprisonment, the victims of this mass indoctrination try to relativize why it is so great and what freedoms they have. However, the list of their alleged freedoms is more like a penal system, and they always have to ask permission, like small children, and in principle everything is forbidden except what suits the breeders or their owners. Indoctrination is part of the training and breeding program. The state slave must under no circumstances become independent and autonomous, and must repeatedly demand his state prison and the prison guards himself through elections. Only then is he a good slave and will be left alone. Of course, anyone who questions the system is criminalized, persecuted, and often killed. Depending on the level of awareness, reach, and impact of the information, the system alternates between criminal sentences, prison sentences, targeted executions, or provoked accidents so as not to delegitimize the state terrorist system and lose the associated power and influence. As in the penal system, there are wake-up, work, meal, and bed times, and with good behavior, prisoners are even allowed to leave the prison and go free. Like animals, human resources are naturally labeled with numbers, which they carry with them to prove that they belong to a particular slave plantation so that they can be left alone. Whereas in the cotton fields, the markings were burned into the slave's skin or scratched with knives so that the slave owner knew which slaves belonged to him. Today, the markings are worn voluntarily on the body. The victims voluntarily allow themselves to be recorded with all their identification features and even pay for their own digital ankle tag in the form of an ID card or, in the near future, a digital identity, where the masters decide digitally and via artificial intelligence in real time what the state prisoner may and may not do. So what distinguishes the slaves who live imprisoned in a government or state construct from truly free people? A prisoner in a detention center is allowed to work, go shopping every week, and is even woken up and put to bed by the prison warden. He can even have breakfast in his sleeping loo, work and receive visitors, even from the neighboring cells, known in specialist circles as the lockup. He can do sport, further his education, read comics, watch TV, listen to the radio, and take part in the social activities of the prison. And if the prison were a country, he could even travel abroad with good management, that is, apply for furlough. If something happens to him, he can go to the doctor, the priest, or simply to the social worker. If he does not like something, for example his imprisonment, he can complain in writing by filling out a complaints form in specialized circles, notification form, and informing the prison management of his concerns. If they refuse to take certain measures, things can become bitter for them, including physical violence. Even if there are no weapons in the prisons, shooting personnel are called in from outside to force something on the prisoners. So it's no different to the state prisons we affectionately call cities and countries, our pseudo-freedom, where any criticism of the government or desire for freedom is bludgeoned by violent criminals in uniform and quite often ends up in a much smaller prison. The definition of freedom is basically very simple: to be free to determine one's own life without harming other people. The emphasis is on one's own life. What do I mean by that? Quite simply, Neither I nor you nor any government have the right to interfere in the organization of another person's life. A serious and helpful structure, which a government definitely is not, should support the people. A serious and helpful structure, which a government definitely is not, should support the people, give them as much freedom as possible, but without harming them or restricting them in any way. It is very interesting how the human breeders, this global human breeding, have built up, and the deeper you go into this world of thought, the more horrified you are that the victims, the actual slaves, are not even aware of their lack of freedom. They defend and even advocate their captivity and prisons and demand that someone else rules over them, tells them how to live. This destructive adaptation is not only mentally ill, it even resembles a collective psychopathy that the victims are not aware of, precisely because they are unaware of it. Like a policeman who systematically robs, blackmails, terrorizes, abuses, or kills other people and sees nothing wrong with his actions. Here, too, there is a lack of healthy neuronal networking in the brain, where crime was previously programmed into the mind as something desirable and socially adapted through destructive indoctrination. Whether someone is a criminal, therefore, depends solely on their clothing. A distinction is made between good murderers and thieves and bad murderers and thieves. The good thieves and murderers who wear a uniform are not punished for their crimes, of course, and the bad ones who don't wear a uniform go to prison and are locked away. The good thieves, robbers, and murderers of the system always know where their slaves are. The registers and the coercion associated with them enable them to attack, kidnap, or kill their victims and even their children at any time. They know in which house, wing, cell block, floor, and in which zone or district they live. This, of course, makes it easier to track down and exploit the slaves anytime and anywhere in order to impose their will to rule. In this way, the naughty dissidents can be tracked down at any time in order to work them off, blackmail them, or impose all the inhumane rules, fines, prohibitions, or punishments on them, or, if necessary, kidnap them and temporarily transfer them to a smaller prison so that they submit to the system and its norms through education. That is, conditioning. Back then, slaves were whipped in the cotton fields if they did not do what the master ordered. Today, the victims of the state terrorist system we affectionately call government are rewarded with fines, bank account garnishments, prison sentences, dawn raids, or executions in their own bedrooms if they defy the system. For the human breeder, it is essential to know at all times how many individuals make up the herd, where the herd is mainly located, and how it is distributed in the state cage. Just as a cattle farmer has an overview of his herd and even labels them with numbers in order to know who is to be sprayed or slaughtered, and when. For this purpose, the plantations were divided into zones, districts, or boroughs in order to be able to allocate the stock to an area at any time. It is therefore customary to assign unique numbers to the slaves on a plantation, which are known as personnel numbers in our state prison system. In this way, every prisoner in the state prison can be located, taxed, deprived of his freedom, and if he refuses to pay for his enslavement and captivity and physically resists, killed. The slaves are divided into different castes, as has been practiced in India for generations. There are slaves with certain privileges who are allowed to oppress, injure, and eliminate other people, for example, and those who are allowed to give them orders to do so. Human breeding is structured like a pyramid, at the top of which sit the end-time cults that oversee everything and distribute their power in stages to their subjects, or rather tools. However, this is only a rough structure that includes thousands of other structures and networks that they have built up over generations in order to keep billions of people as slaves. It is always fascinating to observe how every year they work on systematically exterminating people in order to reduce population density. In the past, wars were primarily waged to set two camps against each other, but today we can not only resort to weapons, but also to chemical warfare agents provided by the pharmaceutical industry in the form of vaccines or medicines so that people administer the poison to themselves, and the corresponding symptoms lead to death or to an incurable disease that the body can no longer cope with. Under the guise of public health, poisons are often sprayed and sold to people as a cure for invented diseases or pandemics, after they have been frightened and panicked by the media in order to increase their willingness to take them voluntarily. Like the mouse that does not question the free cheese in the mousetrap, the victims of the vaccine genocide do not question anything and even finance their own deaths, although the mouse is even smarter in this respect and does not finance its own trap or poison. These crimes could not be more perfidious, but the slave obeys and submits again and again. These are inherited patterns of behavior that do not disappear anytime soon because they are passed on from generation to generation. It is an eternal cycle, accompanied by constant manipulation, fear, panic, and blackmail to keep the slaves in their captivity. People are offered no alternative to the existing system. Any alternative that involves freedom and a self-determined life is fundamentally criminalized, sabotaged, and fought against by the system. Any independence and any attempt to leave the democratic system and interrupt the indoctrination, for example, to remove children from the indoctrination camps in order to protect them, is pursued by the system with armed force up to and including execution in front of one's wife or children. This fact alone should give us pause for thought and make us realize the danger posed by these government structures. Whether left, right, or green, every modern tree hugger will find a system party that appeals to them in order to keep the overall system alive with their participation. The state sect doesn't care which party its subjects vote for. The diversity of parties was not created to create real alternatives so that something changes for the benefit of the slaves, but to divide people into camps because they are so much easier to control and can also be set against each other. It's like Coca-Cola. They have different brands like Coke, Fanta, Sprite, Mezzo-Mix to suit every taste, but they all belong to one company. Every time consumers are dissatisfied and don't buy, a new flavor is simply invented to keep them as customers. The state prison system works in the same way. To prevent the prisoners from leaving the system or turning their backs on the breeders, political parties are invented to keep the victims in the state cages. They lure people in with the hope that the system is interested in them, but the reality is that it is only as interested in people as a cattle farmer is in his cattle. People are not allowed to live free from oppression and state plunder under any circumstances, so all the stops are pulled out, including coups, civil wars, or other self-initiated conflicts, to keep the people in fear and panic, so that they will once again place themselves in the hands of the next installed ruler. Every year, they promise the victims of this predatory system that they will improve things for them so that they are better off, in order to keep them on a tight leash with promises that are not contractually stipulated anywhere and that they never have to honor. And if a victim of this system disagrees with any rules, laws, or measures and confronts the authorities that implement them, they are simply told, "That's not for us to decide anyway. Just vote for a different party next time." I just imagine the image of a person being beaten almost to death by a police force and them saying to the victim's face, "That wasn't our decision. We didn't get to decide that. It's just our job." I'm sure those who have participated in mass shootings in the past have said this to their victims. "Don't take it personally. It's just a headshot. That's the way it is, and it shouldn't be questioned. Next time, better choose the right party." Right, it's so easy. Why didn't I come up with this brilliant idea myself? Now I'm lying on the floor covered in blood, with a broken jaw and paraplegic, thinking about the upcoming election. What a mental illness. And if anyone thinks I'm making this up, I'm sorry to disappoint you all. These are phrases that come up again and again when state mercenaries try to get out of trouble after committing crimes. The results of this perfidious political and party political game speak for themselves, but only if you look at them negatively. If humanity were listed on the stock exchange, things would have been going downhill for generations. People are getting worse from year to year, while the parasites and their accomplices in this state terrorist organization are getting better and better. Some of them are so shameless and disrespectful that while people are losing their livelihoods and prosperity, they increase the tax burden through taxation, thereby causing lasting damage to the people, in order to then use the stolen and extorted money to give themselves repeated wage increases or inflation adjustments, whether the slaves like it or not. If people are no longer prepared to co-finance their robberies, war games, and mass genocides through taxes, and therefore no longer pay, they are persecuted and often imprisoned. This democracy that the inmates of the state are led to believe has nothing even remotely to do with freedom. You cannot leave this demonocracy. It is forced on people under the threat of blackmail and violence. This system is so just that, under the guise of this terrorist structure, they not only finance genocides from the money they have previously stolen, but also distribute the money everywhere for their mental illnesses, but not for the people themselves who have earned the money. They don't even let them share in it or ask them if they agree to it. To make matters worse, they have no say at all. There are no committees in which people can help shape their country, make decisions, or work on new concepts. Whenever people open a school on their own initiative, for example, to do something different or try out a new monetary system, it doesn't take long for the state terrorists and their helpers to appear on the scene to nip any change in the bud and criminalize it. They keep people like pets, which they can train, beat, abuse, and rob at will. These are the same strategies that have been used successfully for generations in the mafia, but also in prostitution. While the mafia uses its thugs and the threat of violence to blackmail people into handing over part of their money for supposed protection, prostitutes are also robbed of a large part of their money. Recently, a metamorphosis has taken place in which the state itself has become a pimp, enriching itself through forced taxation on the suffering of women who sell their bodies. It is important to understand that the state, that is all governments in the world, act just as criminally as the mafia or a pimp. People are blackmailed into paying according to almost the same rules and principles. It is almost absurd that people do not realize or do not want to realize this. While the mafia, like a government, advertises that it offers protection, the pimp advertises that nothing will happen to the lady, for example. But there is no difference. One is only socially established, and the other is not socially recognized and is rejected. No matter how you look at it, all structures that blackmail people lead to the same result, to violence, if you don't submit to their criminal structures. From the day they were born, from the day their parents transferred them to the captivity of the state with their birth certificate, people have received a permanent debt that they have inherited. Throughout their lives, they must submit unconditionally to a violent democratization that rips them off like a Christmas goose, without having any influence over what happens to this money. The money is distributed by the state terrorists in office to the upper castes as they please. Any desire for co-determination is dismissed with the phrase, "Next time, vote for the right party." Right. We've already been there. We are constantly spinning in an evolutionary endless loop that burns us humans out, dehumanizes us, and keeps us in constant captivity. The mere fact that people don't own an inch of land leaves the majority cold. Indoctrination has struck here too. Everything is argued with the fact that we have too little space, and that is proof enough. It is enough for a media whore of the system to stand in front of the camera and simply claim that. The fact that there are several thousand square meters for every person is simply hushed up and ignored or ridiculed with pseudoscience. It's simply brilliant. State terrorists collect money for land that belongs to no one and keep an entire people dispossessed, except for those who go into debt and are prepared to pay taxes for the rest of their lives for land that belongs to no one. It is a crime to keep humanity in total dependence on governments and to deprive them of any freedom and any basis to be free. If people nevertheless come up with the idea of taking a piece of land to live on, it doesn't take long for the authorities and uniformed mercenaries to turn up and threaten, blackmail, beat, arrest, or kill people if they refuse to pay or leave. Many people in the world have the desire to live freely and self-determinedly, to organize their lives as they please without harming other people. There have been many attempts around the world, but also in Germany and other European countries, where people came together and farmed a piece of land until the state mafia came along with its regulations and smashed or destroyed every concept of freedom by force. The state parasite does not want free competition where people live in self-determination and freedom. Only concepts where people can be permanently kept as slaves and taxed are allowed to exist. The aim is to fight and criminalize everything that could give people the wrong idea of freedom and self-determination. According to the motto, slavery is freedom, and freedom is slavery, people are indoctrinated by the media and schools in such a way that they automatically equate everything that has anything to do with freedom with chaos. State slaves are almost mantra-like programmed to believe that freedom means anarchy and therefore automatically chaos. In doing so, they fundamentally misunderstand the concept of anarchy and scare people. Of course, they do not explain to them that anarchy is almost the same as what they are already living, only without rulers and their blackmail, violence, and manipulation, and that there are rules there too. Liberal and therefore natural structures always have a tendency to regulate themselves naturally, while the state artificially creates and maintains problems in order to profit from them. Governments create problems non-stop and pretend to solve them. For example, the same warmongers and arsonists who have made wars possible talk about peace, and the same ones who have ruined our economy talk about recovery and prosperity. How they talk about truth and freedom and at the same time censor and punish people for dissenting thoughts. And let's not forget those who talk about law and order and commit crimes all the time, who behave like wild beasts towards people because they wear a uniform and spend most of their time blackmailing, threatening, robbing, expropriating, imprisoning, terrorizing, beating, or killing others, and who are not above abducting children from other people's families. Role models are not people who commit crimes, but people who avoid crime. People who master avoidance and de-escalation techniques to create peace and develop strategies to reconcile people or give them more freedom. Police officers who sabotage peaceful demonstrations and mingle with the civilian population in order to provoke excesses of violence are common practice in any totalitarian regime and have nothing to do with being friends and helpers. They are a tremendous danger to any liberal structure because they protect criminals, sabotage, and prevent any evolutionary reorientation of the population, blindly obey any order, no matter how criminal, and always oppose the people and their freedom. A pedophile who rapes children is just as protected by this system as a molester, murderer, or rapist. They come out of prison a few years later and pick up where they left off, and they know it. They know exactly that nothing will happen to them if they rape, kill, or stab, because this system needs these criminals to maintain a threatening backdrop, to suggest to the state slaves that they need protection, precisely from these people. Just like the prostitute needs the pimp, or the restaurant owner in Sicily supposedly needs the mafia. Governments, like the mafia, religions, and pimps, have their own secret services. They are services that spy on people, sabotage them, and use terror and fear to keep them in an endless spiral of fear. Whether governments, religions, the mafia, or pimps, terror, which can also take place on a psychological level, is used to subjugate victims and make them dependent on themselves. A prostitute who has been beaten up on behalf of a pimp will voluntarily place herself under his protection the next day, and a restaurant owner in Sicily will voluntarily pay the mafia in order to feed his family. And when a lorry crashes into a Christmas market and kills people, or a contract terrorist makes the streets unsafe barefoot and with a machete in his hand, the willingness to be permanently plundered by an equally violent and predatory system grows, and the circle closes. A system of rule needs enough threats to keep the state calves on a tight leash. According to the motto, we have to pay taxes so that a lorry doesn't crash into another Christmas market, or a terrorist with a knife indiscriminately injures or kills people on pavements, trains, or buses. To this end, Media constructs are being created in which even the opposition is helping to spread these panic messages. Individual cases of genuinely sick people are artificially and exponentially inflated to create the suggested feeling that knife men are everywhere and that we need more cameras, more surveillance, more laws, and more police. All repressive measures interlock and have a redundant and simultaneous effect on people. These messages of panic and fear can take many forms. Be it a climate hoax in which the world is almost coming to an end for the 10th time, and our life expectancy is being revised ever downwards in years to increase the potential for fear. A fake virus where viruses flying through the air are supposed to cause billions of deaths. A comet impact that will graze the Earth for the 5th time. A heat wave that will kill us where Karl Lauterbach wants to deploy heat buses throughout Germany. And temperatures of around 20 degrees, shown in dark red by the system's mendacious smear media, to visually emphasize the panic, or the migrants who are now getting married with children and want to stab us all and want to introduce Sharia law in Germany. People get infected by these panic messages, rarely or never check them, jump on everything and cut themselves every time. All problems, conflicts, and scaremongering are caused and initiated by people who pretend to inform us, protect us, and avert harm from the people. And since the victims of this system are used to others solving the problems for them, they entrust their lives and their future to the same psychopaths in the governments that caused these problems in the first place. They have the naive hope that this time they will be saved because they have learnt from their mistakes, or they tell themselves that they only have to vote for the right party to change things. In other words, a party of the same system. For them, saviors or foreign actors are more important than their own freedom and opportunities. If they were to break out of their permanent subjugation loop and do some soul-searching, they would realize that only they themselves can save the day. But let's transfer the reality recorded so far to a free system based on natural laws, in which everyone is responsible for their actions and crimes, and there is no one to protect them from punishment or the wrath of the victims with prisons. Criminals would not get far in this free system based on natural laws because they would know that every attack, robbery, or assault would have immediate consequences. A child molester, rapist, or murderer who is not protected by the state will think twice about whether his life is more important to him than the crime he wants to commit. A government provides criminals with a buffer zone in which they can let off steam and automatically creates the fear scenarios that governments need in order to keep their victims in their system and rob them. But it gets even more perfidious. People who defend themselves against external violence in a state terrorist system must learn to distinguish between the perpetrators of violence. If the terrorists are wearing a uniform, they are not allowed to fight back because they will be additionally penalized for doing so, while terrorists who are not wearing a uniform may only be killed by uniformed terrorists. And if the victim makes the mistake of killing an attacker who is not wearing a uniform in order to protect his own life, the attacked victim should preferably have no martial arts experience because he will be additionally penalized for this. And victims without martial arts experience and witnesses who fatally injure the attacker often end up in prison because they wanted to live and not be killed. These comparisons are neither exaggerated nor taken out of context and are based on court decisions I have made in the past. Slaves used to be whipped in the cotton fields for stealing food. In Germany, for example, state prisoners were dragged to court for a long time for stealing food from supermarket rubbish bins, until the political parasites sold it to the victims as a merciful boon that it was now okay to collect food from the rubbish and were even praised for it. The same behavior occurred with the mafia, who built schools and temporarily supported people in order to have the support of the population, while at the same time robbing, extorting, or killing other people like today's governments. There are endless analogies to the mafia and pimps, which I use again and again in my lectures, where even religions make use of these techniques. A prostitute who has served one more client and does not report this to the pimp is like a commodity that has been sold without paying the obligatory tax, alternatively concealing the income from the mafia. In both cases, the victims are exposed to violence, terrorized, beaten, blackmailed, imprisoned, or killed. Religions use similar techniques, suggesting to victims that they will go to hell after death, or that they will be rewarded for accepting the ideologies. Alternatively, they are persecuted, humiliated, beaten, and terrorized by other followers of a sect if they do not submit to the scriptures of a sect, and therefore do not accept or live by them. This is comparable to people who reject democracy or dictatorship because they do not see any real freedom in these structures and feel oppressed and unfree by them. And if we look closely, we will realize that people in a mafia structure, in religions, governments, and even with a pimp, are deprived of their freedom, their self-determination, and are subjected to reprisals, persecution, torture, violence, and often death. All systems are based on the same values and differ from structure to structure only in the form of application. Like a moving film based on photographs with a sequence of images to set the images in motion, or an animated film that is drawn and also produces a flowing sequence of images, and conversely, the same result, that is, a film scene. Or a room that can be a prison but at the same time also a flat. Now you're probably thinking about whether your flat can also be your prison. Whilst we're at it, what's the difference between your flat and a prison? A prison cell is a room with a door and windows. Your flat is a room with doors and windows. In a prison cell, there is a toilet, a bed, a sink, a desk, cupboards, and even a light switch, which you also find in a flat. So what are the main differences? Is it the postman who wears different clothes? Or is it the room service that you don't even get in your flat, that even brings food to your front door and someone cooks for you? In a prison, you are not allowed to leave your cell. You are only allowed to leave your home if your government allows you to. Some have experienced this in the fake COVID pandemic, where people have been chased through the streets worldwide by uniformed terrorists in the name of governments, and in some cases, people have even been shot at for leaving their homes. If you break out of a prison, they will also hunt you down and even shoot you if you don't do what they want you to do. No matter what you do, in a democracy as well as in a dictatorship, everything is punished with death, comparable to religions, the mafia, and the pimp. In prison, you have a number under which you are listed, and at home you are registered like a farmer's cattle, so that the breeder knows where he can pick you up, rob you, and suppress or slaughter you if you stray too far from the system. Your children are also registered so that the breeders know how many resources they have at their disposal to then abuse them in their system, use them in wars, and brainwash and indoctrinate them. Their systems are set up so that indoctrination starts as early as possible and is imposed with absolute brutality so that no one will think of withdrawing the children from the system. People who have given birth to their children freely, without a birth certificate or registration, have their children snatched away, abducted, deported, and placed in indoctrinated system families in order to bring them into line with the system. Regardless of whether religions or governments are involved, indoctrination begins in childhood, where families are locked up in ideological prisons through collective coercion because they do not want to be excluded in order to serve the system. All power structures, whether religions, governments, political parties, or even criminal organizations such as the mafia, are subordinate to a ruling end-time sect that coexists with the governments in the same way, as could be clearly observed during the COVID fake pandemic, where even the churches have excluded people who have not masked or injected themselves. There are many families in this world who occupy a certain place in their power structure, but they do not rule. They only serve an authority that controls the whole world and uses these families and their networks as tools. They are also not known in the media, have no religion, and their names are not known. Now we should actually say or think that they are evil. But are they really evil? Is it the rulers who build our prisons? Is it the rulers who wage our wars, who kill innocent people or take away their freedom? Or is it us? Is it the Rockefeller clan that is on our doorstep kidnapping our children? Or is it the policeman who believes in an ideology, a state religion, and kidnaps the child from an intact family because the father of the family does not agree with their indoctrination? Is it Bill Gates who forces facial recognition or vaccinations on people? Or is it we who accept their vaccinations, measures, systems, and technologies and allow ourselves to be further robbed of our freedom and health? It is we who do not oppose this terror, who accept it and watch as digitalization unleashes a flood of digital injustice upon us. Each of us has the free will to do what we want and to refuse any destructive structure at any time or to find ways out of prison. So when we point the finger upwards at the evil rulers, politicians, and other power-obsessed creatures, we should first point it at ourselves, because we are the biggest sinners, the biggest criminals and murderers. This will certainly hit you hard, but you are supporting these crimes with your money, your taxes, your consumption, and your work. And you are feeding a highly criminal system, a network that thrives on greed, selfishness, and avarice. Who is robbing you through taxation? I'm telling you, it could be your neighbor, your uncle, your aunt or mother who works in these authorities and administrations. It could even be your cousin who works for the police and who kidnaps the children of a strange family in which he has absolutely no business, because we as a society simply accept it. We don't want to be fair. We don't want free systems, because then some of us would no longer get monopoly money. So no more printed paper snippets that we worship like idols, and even sell our children to these systems in order to incorporate them into their breeding programs as new slaves so that we ourselves can be left alone. Am I being too reproachful? Yes, I am and remain so because I've been aware of this injustice for far too long, and too many remain silent about it because they don't want to catch themselves realizing how bad and perverted they really are. Many of us would sell and betray our children, or even our mum or dad to the system for good money in exchange for benefits and privileges. We also saw this during the fake pandemic, how far people went, how unscrupulous they are, and how they bullied, denounced, and fought each other without respect or decency. These were our friends, mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles. The system is not Rockefeller, Rothschild, or a government. The system is us. We have made the world what we are, the way we feel and think. And if you think the world is bad, then change your thoughts, your actions, and your behavior, because if you carry on as before, this world will remain what it is, a prison, a madhouse. This world is a reflection of our society, and if we accept greed, envy, robbery, terror, and wars, we will also poison future generations and make them live in captivity. A better, fairer, and freer life has always been conceivable and possible, even today. But we have done nothing for it. We have preferred to leave the thinking to others so that we have more room for our sins, for our plastic waste and our game consoles or drugs, for our addictions, where we entertain and distract ourselves from morning to night. We were never really free. We are not even working on becoming truly free, and many do not really understand the word freedom. They define as freedom what governments, religions, or ideologies have defined as freedom. We are not living our own lives, but the lives of our owners who rule over us and keep us in their human farms. It is long overdue that we go our own way as humanity and break out of their cages, that we do not evolve from a cotton plantation to a high-tech prison in order to be oppressed and made even more unfree, but that we evolve to the point where we understand what freedom really is and do everything we can to make it part of our lives for the first time in human history. Up to now, we have lived our entire lives in a prison, in an illusory freedom in which we could not see the bars in front of our eyes. It is up to us to recognize our lack of freedom and to break through the barriers that rob us of truth and perception. Imagine for a moment that you are free. There is no one who wants to take something away from you, no one forcing you to pay for something you don't want, no one who takes your children away from you because you are different and want to organize your life with your family yourself. where neither you nor anyone else has power over other people to drive them into wars and suffering. A world in which new opportunities open up for everyone that are perhaps beyond anyone's imagination today, in which we can evolve as humanity and utilize all our creative powers to create a better world, and in which no criminal structures presume to dictate how we should live and shape our lives. A world in which you can live your own life for the first time. It's up to us. It's our world. Let's create a new world, a better world, and leave behind everything that has made our lives a living hell.